At this time, the attorneys have the opportunity to present to you their arguments. They're not going to argue with you. Argument is that stage of the proceedings where the attorneys comment on what they believe the evidence has shown in this case. As I mentioned to you in my instructions, the statements of the attorneys during the argument phase of the trial are not evidence. The attorneys will not intentionally misrepresent or misstate the evidence, but as advocates, they may have had a different view than you. Remember, you're the only fact finders in this case. So if you heard or saw something differently from an attorney, rely upon your own individual determination. Sometimes jurors ask during the deliberations, may we have read back a particular attorney's argument, or may we have a PowerPoint or a chart that's presented during argument. Ladies and gentlemen, if it's not in evidence, you don't get it. So please be aware of that. If you want to take notes, by all means, take notes during argument, but recognize that the argument phase simply is not evidence. The people have an opportunity to present an opening argument. The defense, if it wishes, may present its argument. And if the defense presents an argument, the people have a second argument called a closing or rebuttal argument. That is because the people have the burden of proof. After the parties have presented to you their arguments, I'll give you the concluding series of instructions. Thank you. At this time, Mr. Walgren, on behalf of the people, do you wish to present your opening argument?
Please, Your Honor.
You may. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Let me begin by, and I think I extend this from all the parties and everyone involved in this trial, just first thank each and every one of you for your service in this case, for being an extremely, by all accounts, punctual, diligent, and attentive jury. All the parties appreciate it, and all the parties would ask that you just hang on a bit longer while we get through this last phase of the trial. As the court indicated, this is a closing argument, and it gives us an opportunity to go through the evidence that you've heard, to apply that evidence to the law, and to present the case in a final summation. You've heard from, I believe, 49 witnesses. You've been presented with 330-plus exhibits throughout the case, extending weeks, multiple items of evidence, multiple witnesses, and a great deal of evidence to consider. At the end of the day, however, and as I spoke to you about during voir dire, this case will come down to whether or not you believe Conrad Murray acted with gross negligence or criminal negligence in his treatment of Michael Jackson. It'll come down to whether or not you believe he was a substantial factor in Michael Jackson's death. He need not be the only factor. He need not be the only cause. He only need be a substantial factor, which is defined as something more than trivial and more than remote. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. The evidence in this case is abundantly clear that Conrad Murray acted with criminal negligence, that Conrad Murray caused the death of Michael Jackson, that Conrad Murray left Prince, Paris, and Blanket without a father. For them, this case doesn't end today or tomorrow or the next day. For Michael's children, this case will go on forever because they do not have a father. They do not have a father because of the actions of Conrad Murray. Now, what this is fundamentally about is trust. Trust between a doctor and a patient. We've heard a great deal about the doctor-patient relationship, this hallowed relationship, this special, historic relationship where a patient relies on a doctor's best medical judgment, where a doctor is assumed and is entrusted to provide the best medical care to do no harm to his patient. and that a doctor will use that best medical judgment and provide that best medical care regardless of the requests of the patient. Because a doctor has a legal duty, an ethical duty, to do no harm. A doctor has a duty to his patient. And from each and every doctor that you heard from in this trial, whether called by the people or the defense, you heard that if a request was made to provide medical treatment that could cause harm, that doctor in the end would have to say no and walk away. The doctor is the decision maker. The doctor is the one entrusted with the medical knowledge. The doctor is the one in the relationship who at the end of the day makes the decision as to what is proper medical care and what is in the well-being of the patient. You've heard from many doctors in this case who told you that if they were presented with this situation, they would absolutely say no and walk away. Not only did you hear about that in a hypothetical sense, but you heard from specific doctors called by the defense who were presented with such a request and said no and walked away. Because they believe and acted in accordance with their belief that a doctor has an obligation, a solemn obligation, to first do no harm to their patient. Conrad Murray violated that sacred trust each and every day. Each and every day, Conrad Murray violated that sacred trust premised on that hallowed relationship between a doctor and a patient. It was an employer-employee relationship. Conrad Murray sought payment for services rendered. Services rendered being the provision of propofol to Michael Jackson in his bedroom on an almost nightly basis for over 2 months, according to Conrad Murray's own words. For services rendered, not for proper medical care, not for the sake of doing no harm, but an employee-employer relationship for services rendered. This relationship of trust that is so important between a doctor and a patient was grossly corrupted by the actions of Conrad Murray. Michael Jackson trusted Conrad Murray. He trusted him with his life. He trusted him with his own individual life and the future lives of his children, trusting that Conrad Murray, as Michael slept, would care for him so that in the morning he would awake to share a meal with his children. But Conrad Murray corrupted that relationship, and for that, Michael Jackson paid with his life. We know that on June 24th, 2009, Michael Jackson performed at the Staples Center and by all accounts gave a great performance. He was optimistic, he was looking toward the future, and you've seen live footage of him dancing and singing and performing and doing what he loved to do. We know from the date this image was taken on June 24, 2009, that in about 12 short hours, Michael Jackson lay in his bed, palms up, head tilted to the side, dead in his bedroom at 100 North Carrollwood. We know during this time frame, June 24, 2009, what Michael was doing. He was rehearsing, he was practicing, he was preparing for one of the biggest tours of his career. And we know now from hearing all the evidence in this case about his outlook on the future, what he planned to do, what he planned for his family, what he planned for his business future. We know he was optimistic. Was he anxious about the tour? Absolutely certain he was. He's a 50-year-old man embarking on one of the biggest tours of his career, 50 sold-out shows at the O2 Arena in London. Who wouldn't be anxious about that? He wanted to satisfy his fans, his family, his children. He was a creative genius and a perfectionist. And he went about these tasks striving for perfection, striving to perform at the top of his level, striving to satisfy the fans that had been so loyal to him for so many years. And he wanted perfection. And he wanted to be the best. And despite any normal anxieties he may have had about that endeavor, he was optimistic. He was excited. He was looking to the future. We know October 2008 that he had relayed to Randy Phillips. If you recall, they were at the Bel Air Hotel before Michael had moved into 100 North Carrollwood. The children were there running around in Halloween masks and costumes, playing, and that's how one of the reasons Randy Phillips remembered that it was October, because it was near Halloween. And Michael had expressed that he didn't want to be a vagabond anymore. He'd been traveling. He wanted to buy a nice house for his children. He wanted to settle down. He was looking toward the future. He was making plans, long-term plans, for both himself and his 3 children to whom he was so dedicated. We learned about the tour and what Michael hoped to accomplish with this tour and why it was important to him. Kenny Ortega told us how this environmental message of Michael's had always been so important. And it resonated through his songs, not just his own personal beliefs, but his messages to the public, to the lyrics in his songs. And this was profoundly important to him. And he wanted to share this message. He wanted to express this voice throughout this tour. He wanted to repay his fans and again do a top-level performance in gratitude to his fans for all their years of loyalty and support. And probably most importantly, he wanted to do it for his children who had not seen their father put on such a performance. And he wanted them to come see what he does so well. He wanted his children to see what he spent his whole life doing. Being creative, being a performer, being an entertainer. He wanted his children to experience that. And that was one of the foundations for his desire to go forward with this tour. We know his children were paramount to him. One of the things he'd expressed to Randy Phillips that part of the contractual, the deal they had, he wanted a large estate in London while the tour took place because he didn't want the children to be cooped up in a hotel room. He didn't want the family to be trapped in a hotel surrounded by paparazzi. So he wanted a large estate with streams and horses and animals so his kids could lead as normal a life as possible while this tour unfolded. We knew about his future plans to make movies. He wanted to make a feature-length film based on the song Thriller and the video Thriller. He discussed other movies. He wanted to get into directing. He had plans. He had hopes. He had dreams, as we all do, both for himself and his family. We heard about his desire to open a children's hospital. We heard this not only from the drugged recording of May 10th, 2009 at 9:05 in the morning, but in Conrad Murray's own statement to the police, he comments that Michael wanted to create this children's hospital, to give this to the world. That Conrad Murray said he was hoping, or he had been asked to be the medical director of this children's hospital. Michael had plans and hopes and dreams. We knew also that the tour was discussed. It had been discussed that the tour, following the successful leg in London, these 50 shows, it was hoped that it would expand across the world, go through the United States. Again, there were plans and dreams and hopes that were very well known to those around Michael Jackson during this time. But we also know, as we heard from multiple witnesses, that what was paramount to Michael were his 3 children. And his dreams and hopes were intertwined with those same dreams and hopes that he aspired for his 3 kids. One of the reasons he was so excited about the tour, if you recall, was because it was going to be beginning that summer. And the kids, relieved from the obligations of school, would be able to accompany him and go on the tour and see their dad perform in London. But none of this came to be. None of these dreams, hopes, aspirations, or desires came to be, because on June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson, just 50 years old, was pronounced dead. We know and we will discuss the circumstances of that death. We know and will discuss how Paris had to come in and see her father in that condition and scream out, "Daddy," as she broke down in tears. How Prince had a shocked face, shocked look on his face, and was crying. That's what the actions of Conrad Murray did. Not just to Michael Jackson, but to his children. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant is charged with one single count of involuntary manslaughter for the criminal negligence that was exhibited and caused the death of Michael Jackson. I want to talk to you briefly about the law and the applicability of the law in this case. The law as it relates to involuntary manslaughter. And I want you to remember, if you look back whenever it was, 6 weeks ago or thereabouts, when I stood in this very well and we were going through voir dire, and I discussed with each and every one of you. I said, you may have unanswered questions at the end of this trial. There may be 100 questions, and maybe 97 of them are left unanswered. But under the law, you need only answer just 3. I ask each and every one of you, are you the type of juror that could do that? Are you the type of juror that could follow the law, recognize that you have an extremely important role, but also a limited role, to answer the questions presented by the law? And I asked you, in all candor, are you the type of juror that would just be frustrated? You need to answer everything or you cannot reach a verdict. And each and every one of you assured me that you would be able to follow the law, determine the facts, apply the law, and answer what needs to be answered under the law. And should that mean that you leave here with unanswered questions, you would still be able to fulfill your obligation. Now, involuntary manslaughter, as the court read to you, there are 2 separate theories. And the reason there are 2 separate theories in this unique case is because Conrad Murray, the defendant, is a medical doctor. And as an everyday, for lack of a better word, civilian, you are liable under involuntary manslaughter for acts of gross negligence. As a doctor, however, the law recognizes this special relationship. And the law states that a doctor has a legal duty of care, such that if a doctor fails to act, a doctor is also criminally liable under involuntary manslaughter. So where a non-doctor may not be liable under that theory, a doctor is recognized by the law as having this additional obligation to have a legal duty of care to his patient. And that a failure to act, a failure to live up to that legal duty of care, also subjects the person to criminal liability under involuntary manslaughter. So the law states that a defendant committed a lawful act, but acted with criminal negligence. And the defendant's act caused, in other words, was a substantial factor in the death of Michael Jackson. The act being that the defendant, a licensed physician, administered propofol and the surrounding criminal negligence in the administration of that propofol. But that is the act that inevitably led to the death of Michael Jackson. Now, as a legal doctor, the defendant has a legal duty to Michael Jackson and failed to perform that legal duty. The failure to perform the legal duty was criminally negligent, and his failure to perform that legal duty caused, again, substantial factor, it need only be more than trivial or remote, caused the death of Michael Jackson. And that is because a physician who has assumed the responsibility to treat and care for a patient has a legal duty to treat and care for that patient. Criminal negligence. A person acts with criminal negligence when he acts in a reckless way that creates a high risk of death or great bodily injury. And a reasonable person would have known that acting in that way would create such a risk. In other words, a person acts with criminal negligence when the way he acts is so far different from the way an ordinarily careful person would act in the same situation, that his act amounts to a disregard for human life or an indifference to the consequences of that act. Now, that is criminal negligence. What criminal negligence is not is an intentional desire to kill. It is not an intentional desire to cause harm. No one has sought to prove that Conrad Murray sought to kill Michael Jackson. This is a criminal negligence theory, that he acted so recklessly with the life of Michael Jackson in his hands that it amounts to indifference to the very life of Michael Jackson. Causation. An act or failure to perform a legal duty causes death if the death is the direct, natural, and probable consequence of the act or failure to perform a legal duty, and the death would not have happened without the act or failure to perform the legal duty. A natural and probable consequence is one that a reasonable person would know is likely to happen if nothing unusual intervenes. An act or failure to perform a legal duty causes death only if it is a substantial factor in causing the death. And here again the definition. A substantial factor is more than a trivial or remote factor. However, it does not have to be the only factor that causes death. Conrad Murray's actions need only rise to more than a trivial or remote factor in causing the death of Michael Jackson for there to be criminal liability under involuntary manslaughter. Now, you've heard throughout the trial, through the defense opening statements, through the defense medical expert, Dr. White, that their theory to date is that Michael Jackson injected himself with propofol, causing his own death. Well, the law accounts for this scenario as well. And what this is called under the law as independent intervening cause. Now, to relieve a defendant of criminal liability, an intervening cause must be unforeseeable and an extraordinary occurrence. Defendant remains criminally liable for the death if the possible consequence might reasonably have been contemplated, or the defendant should have foreseen the possibility of the harm of the kind that could result from his act. We will talk about this more, but you need only go to defendant Conrad Murray's own statement, where he states his own belief and knowledge that Michael Jackson liked to push propofol himself, that he liked to do it himself. You take Conrad Murray's own statements and you cannot, under any rational interpretation of the facts, conclude, if you believe that theory, that it was unforeseeable or is not an expected consequence when the patient is left by himself, abandoned, with benzodiazepines and propofol running through his blood. If you believe that theory, Conrad Murray, in his own words, told you it was a foreseeable consequence and that he is guilty as a substantial factor in causing Michael Jackson's death. Another instruction of importance, the evaluation of the defendant's statements. If you find that the defendant made a false or misleading statement before this trial relating to the charged crime, knowing the statement was false or intending to mislead, that conduct, that false or misleading statement, may show he was aware of the guilt of his crime, and you may consider it in determining his guilt. The fact that Conrad Murray would not tell the paramedics that he administered propofol and had been administering propofol for over 2 months, a fact that Dr. White incredulously described as something that was overlooked, that is a false, misleading statement. That is consciousness of guilt. That is Conrad Murray knowing full well what caused Michael's death. That is Conrad Murray not putting the patient first. That is Conrad Murray putting Conrad Murray first. And that is consciousness of guilt, showing the defendant knew what had transpired. He knew of his guilt, and he was intentionally giving false and misleading statements. But as you well know, it didn't stop with the paramedics. He then continued with the emergency room doctors, never once mentioning propofol, only mentioning lorazepam. These are false, intentionally false, misleading statements when Conrad Murray, as you well know, was fully aware of what had transpired in that room, was fully aware of the information that he had an obligation as a doctor to share, and Conrad Murray failed briefly about the background of this case and the background of what was going on at this time. And it will not be a lengthy discussion because I think all of you are quite familiar with the surrounding circumstances of this case and what was transpiring. But again, we know Conrad Murray had had signed an employment contract, the parties being AEG, Michael Jackson, and Conrad Murray. He had signed it, however, neither of the other parties had signed it. But we know what Conrad Murray expected to receive. What he expected to receive for his services was $150,000 a month, at least for the 10-month duration of the tour, and possibly longer. What he hoped to get for his services in London, because again, this contract was written up and its sole purpose was for the tour, the desire of Michael Jackson to have Conrad Murray as his doctor on this tour in London. We know of Conrad Murray's intent. We know of his desire, as evidenced by the fact that he had already signed the contract, and as further evidence by the fact that he had already sent out letters to all of his practice of medicine indefinitely. Indefinitely. This is the letter Conrad Murray sent out to his patients. He was ceasing medicine. He hit the lottery. Wherever it was going to take him. If it took him to Los Angeles, if it took him to London, this is what Conrad Murray was going to do. He sent out letters to all of his patients and said, I am ceasing the practice of medicine. Now, you've heard a lot about propofol, and I just want to go over a couple things briefly. Again, it's an intravenous sedative hypnotic. It's used for the induction and maintenance of anesthesia or sedation. You know where it's used, you know when it's used, and you know why it's used. What I want to talk volumes of propofol were being shipped and continued all throughout the months, including June of 2009. We know they were all shipped to Nicole Alvarez's apartment, not to a medical office, not whoever else may have picked up the package, but cases of propofol, 10 count, 40 count, being shipped to the apartment of Nicole Alvarez, beginning in April through June. We know, April 6th, there were 10 100 milliliter vials. Those are the large ones. That's People's 30. This is the 100 milliliter vial. 10 of those shipped on April 6th. 25 of the smaller ones for a total of 5,000 milligrams. Then April 28th, 40 of the large vials. 40 large ones, 25 of the small 20 milliliter vials. And again, as far back as April, he is getting lorazepam and midazolam. Keep that in mind when he talks about Conrad Murray talks about in his interview that, well, I was trying to wean him off. So I started going toward lorazepam and midazolam and the benzodiazepines. April 30th, he is receiving 10 vials of lorazepam and 20 vials of midazolam. We then have the recording of May 10th, 2009, on which you hear the tragic, sad voice of Michael Jackson in some sort of drug-induced, slurred stupor. And you hear the voice of Conrad Murray, evidently seated right there as he recorded the conversation, or excuse me, the voice of Michael Jackson. May 10th, 2009. Again, think of this when Conrad Murray says in his interview, well, and referring to the time period of June, that he began to think there was a problem. He began to want to wean him off. This is a month and a half prior to Michael's death. You've heard the recording and you have it in evidence to hear during deliberations if you so desire. It is sad recording. And for reasons unknown, it's made by Conrad Murray on his iPhone and kept on his iPhone by a doctor who will not keep a shred of medical records to be reviewed, by a doctor who could not provide one piece of medical record documenting his nearly 2 months of propofol infusions, but yet on his own personal iPhone, he records Michael Jackson's voice and keeps it. Even in this state, even in this recording, with Michael at such a vulnerable state, he's talking about his plans for the future. He's talking about his desires, that he wants the fans and the people to say, "I've never seen anything like this," referring to his show. It's amazing. He's the greatest entertainer in the world. Even in this state, as he lay in his bedroom with Conrad Murray evidently sitting right next to him, he's thinking about the future and putting on a great performance. But even more than that, he's talking about the Children's Hospital. The biggest in the world, the Michael Jackson's Children's Hospital. In this state, when he has no reason to believe anyone is even listening to him, when he has no reason to believe anyone will ever hear his words, when he has no reason to believe anyone would be documenting it in any way, in this vulnerable state, in his own house, in his own bedroom, he is talking about what he wants to do in the future. And he is talking about his desire to build the greatest children's hospital in the world. These are his true feelings. These are his true desires. This is what he's saying in a private, vulnerable moment of what he wants to do. And for reasons unknown, for reasons completely unknown and unexplained, Conrad Murray sits by his side and records him on his iPhone. And what do we know happens after May 10th, 2009? After hearing this voice, after hearing Michael Jackson in this condition, what does Conrad Murray do just 2 days later? May 12th, 2009, he orders the largest shipment of propofol, 40 of the 100 milliliter vials, 25 of the 20 milliliter vials, and 20 more vials of the benzodiazepine midazolam. Just 2 days after recording Michael Jackson in that state. From May 12th, we go to June 10th. Again, another shipment of 40 large vials. Now 50 of the 20 milliliter small vials. This is June 10th, 2009, 15 days before Michael Jackson's death. Keep these shipments in mind, again, when you consider the truthfulness of Conrad Murray's statements to the police. His statements that he was trying to wean Michael off these agents. When on June 10th, he's ordering 40 large bottles and 50 small vials. Think about these shipments when you think about the truthfulness of Conrad Murray. Following this, he orders still more benzodiazepines. On June 15th, 10 days before Michael's death, 10 more vials of lorazepam and 20 more vials of midazolam. These are massive quantities of propofol. We've learned that this amounts to over 4 gallons of propofol. We're talking amounts of administration in the range of milligrams, and we're talking about a shipment of 4 gallons of propofol. Spread over, if you go from the April 6th date to the date in June, spread over 80 days, that amounts to nearly 2,000 milligrams a day of propofol. But Conrad Murray wants you to believe that on June 25th, 2009, he administered 25 milligrams, 2.5 cc in a 10 cc syringe. When we know from the shipment records that nearly 2,000 milligrams a day are being shipped. And you also know that multiple search warrants were executed in this case. At Conrad Murray's house, at his businesses, at storage facilities, at Nicole Alvarez's apartment. No other propofol bottles were found. No other propofol bottles were found. Now, what do we learn was happening then as it relates to Conrad Murray's knowledge, the knowledge of the devastation he's unleashing on Michael Jackson through this grossly negligent care? We know that in the first week of June, there's a meeting because there's concern about Michael's nutrition, his weight. And there's a meeting held. And Conrad Murray's at the meeting, and he assures everyone he'll take care of it. And by all accounts, everyone at the meeting is satisfied. It appeared Conrad Murray said he's going to take care of it. He's going to take care of it. They knew him to be the personal physician selected by Michael Jackson. He was a medical doctor. He's hearing what they're telling him, and he assures them that he will take care of it. Randy Phillips said it was obvious that Michael had great trust in Conrad Murray. Conrad Murray indicated to everyone there that Michael was in great health, a statement he made multiple times to multiple people. He told Kathy Jory. He told Kenny Ortega. He told Randy Phillips. He told Bob Taylor, the insurance broker, which we will talk about. On June 25th, he assured Bob Taylor that the media reports of any health concerns regarding Michael were not true. When Conrad Murray knew perfectly well there were health concerns. And Conrad Murray marched forward, putting Conrad Murray first, not Michael Jackson first. But this is during the first week of June. What do we know about June 19th? This was the night at the rehearsal when Kenny Ortega was startled. He was concerned about the condition of Michael. Michael had chills. He was trembling. He was rambling. Conditions we learned from Dr. Waldman, the defense expert, could relate to Demerol. They also could relate to benzodiazepines. We learned from the defense witness, Nurse Cheryl Lee, that she looked it up in the physician's desk reference, and these were symptoms ascribed and attributed to propofol. But we know from Kenny Ortega that on June 19th, he is concerned. Michael didn't rehearse. He sat in the audience with Kenny for a period of time. He eventually asked if he could go home, and Kenny said, of course, and was taken and left early from the rehearsal. But we also know that Kenny Ortega did far more to express these concerns than Conrad Murray ever did. But he shared his concerns of the condition of Michael on that evening. He said he needed to get help. He relayed that when it was occurring, he reached out to Conrad Murray but could not reach him. He tried to call him, but he was unable to reach him. But as a result of these concerns, we know on June 20th, there was another meeting at the Carrollwood residence. And at that meeting, we learned that Dr. Murray was upset that Michael had been sent home. Conrad Murray evidently did not appreciate Kenny Ortega getting involved in that aspect of the relationship between Conrad Murray and Michael Jackson. Conrad Murray Unfortunately, that seems to be what happened. Conrad Murray further explained that Michael is physically and emotionally fine, and it should. On June 21st, 2009, we learned that Michael was complaining of being hot and cold, different parts of his body. We know that Fahim Muhammad called telephone Nurse Lee, who was actually out of state, and explained to her what was taking place, and that she indicated Michael needed to be taken to the hospital. We also learned from Fahim Muhammad that Michael Amir Williams later contacted Conrad Murray but we don't know what transpired. That was June 21st, 2009. Sunday, June 21st. We then go to Tuesday, June 23rd, where we know Michael performed and rehearsed at the Staples Center. By all accounts, it was a great performance. Michael, again, was looking toward the future. They were getting close to shipping out to London. Everyone was excited. Adrenaline was running high. The crew, everyone who had been working so hard on putting this tour together, they saw light at the end of the tunnel. And it was about to happen. This is it. The tour was about to happen. June 24th, 2009. Again, the last performance that Michael Jackson ever did. Again, by all accounts, it was tremendous. Everyone was excited. Everyone was optimistic that this was about to get off the ground and that all the work, all the dedication that had been put into putting this tour together, it was about to pay off and they were about to ship out to London. Michael was particularly excited. We heard from Kenny Ortega regarding Michael's love for magic and illusions. And they had talked about it, that tomorrow being June 25th, 2009, the illusion would be ready. And Kenny Ortega described it as flames coming up and this illusion where evidently Michael Jackson would appear out of nowhere. And Michael had a great love and fondness for this type of theatrical presentation. And he was excited about the next day to have this illusion finally be unwrapped. Kenny and Michael talked. Michael said he was very happy. He wanted Kenny to thank everybody and tell them that he loved him. He told Kenny, "I love you." Kenny said, "I love you too," and they hugged and parted ways. Randy Phillips was also at that rehearsal. And he described walking down the hallway with Michael. Michael put his hands on his shoulders and said to Randy, "You got me here, now I'm ready. I can take it from here." They hugged, and that was the last time Randy saw Michael Jackson alive. This was in the subterranean garage of the Staples Center at the conclusion of the rehearsal. And again, that was the You know the house inside and out. This is the front door depicting the glass doors through which you can see into the house. The front foyer area showing both the upstairs banister as well as looking straight through the house, which would to the right be the kitchen, and then going straight to the backyard. The stairs here to the left where the security personnel would often leave gifts and things from the fans prior to Michael retiring to his bedroom to meet up with Conrad Murray. You know the bedroom where Michael Jackson met his demise. You know the walk-in large bedroom-sized closet adjacent to the bedroom. The restroom where you see Michael Jackson's orange-lined bomber jacket that he was wearing when he performed Earth's Song just 12 hours earlier, or rather when he discarded on the bathroom floor probably just an hour or so earlier. His pants bundled up in a ball on the floor from coming home from rehearsal, showering, and proceeding to be given drugs by Conrad Murray. So what is Conrad Murray's version of events? We know what his version of events was on June 25th, 2009. We know that from the paramedics and the UCLA personnel. Michael was dehydrated, he was tired, and he gave him lorazepam to help him sleep. And he witnessed the arrest. That's a medical term. What that means is you observe the person go down. Dr. Cooper talked about that. Other doctors talked about it. A witnessed arrest means just that. You witnessed the arrest. Well, that's Conrad Murray's version of June 25th. But of course, that version changed. Conrad Murray, for from June 25th to June 27th. During that time, the police did not have contact with him. I think his attorneys say in the interview that they had instructed him not to return calls or something of that nature. You have the transcript and the recording. But an arrangement was made. I believe an attorney of Conrad Murray had called, and an arrangement was made to interview the defendant on June 27, 2009 at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Marina del Rey. And you know from the recording and from the transcript that Conrad Murray was there, represented by his attorneys, Mr. Pena and Mr. Chernoff, that Detective Smith and Detective Martinez were there, and of course the defendant, Conrad Murray, was there. And at this stage of the investigation, the police knew very little. They did not have autopsy findings. They did not have toxicology findings. And as you know, the cause of death was not discovered until the toxicology findings were completed and disclosed. What they did know on June 25th is there was no sign of trauma, there was no obvious wounds, nothing to indicate any type of violent death by the hand of another. So they were essentially working in the dark. They were trying to gather information. They were awaiting toxicology reports. They were awaiting findings by the autopsy, by the coroner's office. And they sat down to listen to Conrad Murray, to listen to what he had to say, in the presence of both his lawyers. The detectives were not medically sophisticated. They did not know the terminology. They probably didn't know the proper follow-up questions. They sat, they listened, they asked questions, and they recorded what Conrad Murray chose to tell them on that day. And what we learn is that he was the personal physician to Michael Jackson, who was going to be going on the tour, that the recent care and treatment had began a little over 2 months prior to Michael Jackson's death, that he spent the night at Michael Jackson's house at least 6 nights a week, and that his purpose was to put Michael Jackson to sleep. The detectives ask, when they learn about these nightly doses of propofol, how frequently were these taking place? And Conrad Murray says, in response to the question, more than 10 times? Yes. More than 20 times? 30 days a month, roughly, every day. Those are Conrad Murray's words. He describes that he would give a bolus dose followed by a drip. He describes when he says that on June 25th he gave only 25 milligrams, that he typically gave more. But he gave half of that because of all the benzodiazepines on board. So he describes giving 50 milligram bolus doses followed by a drip in all the nights preceding. But for the night Michael died, and evidently just the night before, or maybe 2 nights before. But again, you have to evaluate Conrad Murray's statement in light of all the evidence as to what weight you give and how much truthfulness you find in these statements. But this is what Conrad Murray told the police on June 27th. Bolus doses followed by a drip. And then he describes a chronology of events of that very night. The IV in the leg to hydrate. The 10 milligram Valium pill sometime after 1 a.m., an oral pill. Said it was slow to act and Jackson needed to sleep. 2 a.m. he gives lorazepam, again according to Conrad Murray. This is intravenous lorazepam. According to Conrad Murray, Jackson remained awake for at least an hour until 3 a.m. when for some reason Conrad Murray switches to midazolam. Again, 2 milligrams given intravenously. The only time Conrad Murray claims Michael slept was this about 12 minutes after the 3 a.m. midazolam injection. During this whole entire evening, according to Conrad Murray, this is the only time Michael Jackson slept, for about 12 minutes following the 3 a.m. midazolam injection. But at 3:20, he's awake, and he describes this continuing until 4:30 a.m.
still was awake. It was 4:30 in the morning, and he was wide awake. And then he complained, "I got to sleep, Dr. Conrad. I have these rehearsals to perform. I must be ready for the show in England. Tomorrow I will have to cancel my performance. I have to cancel my trip because, you know, I cannot function if I don't get the sleep."
So this is at 4:30 a.m. And Conrad Murray is saying that Michael's complaining. He's complaining that he can't sleep. He needs to sleep or he'll have to cancel. Michael is complaining. Those are Conrad Murray's words at 4:30 in the morning. So according to Conrad Murray, at 5 a.m., he gives 2 milligrams of lorazepam. At 7:30 a.m., he gives another 2 milligrams of midazolam. And again, as you go through the statement of Conrad Murray, Michael's still complaining. He's awake. Conrad Murray keeps saying he's complaining, that he cannot sleep, and that at 7:30 a.m. there's still no effect. Pieces together as you go through the evidence with Dr. White hypothesizing that at 7 a.m. Michael Jackson swallowed potentially 16 milligrams of lorazepam. Setting aside the fact that there's no science to discern whether Conrad Murray gave oral lorazepam pills or Michael Jackson swallowed them himself, setting aside that absolute, complete speculation, if you accepted Dr. White's theory, at 7 a.m. Michael Jackson had just taken 16 milligrams of lorazepam. At 7:30 a.m., there's still no effect, and as you go through Conrad Murray's statement, there's no effect throughout. At 10 a.m., Jackson requests propofol. And now this is very important. At 10 a.m., according to Conrad Murray, Michael Jackson says he needs the milk, that it's the only thing that will allow him to sleep, and he needs the milk. And Conrad Murray comments on this in his interview.
I said, if you got propofol now, which of course he referred to as the milk, how much time, how much sleep you expect to have? You know, you're going to be needing to be up no later than noon. And he said, just make me sleep, doesn't matter what time I get. I thought what would happen to your rehearsals and your schedule for the day. You said, I can't function if I don't sleep. They'll have to cancel it, and I didn't want them to cancel it, but they will have to cancel it. So I agreed at that time that I would switch over to the propofol.
Now think about that comment and that statement of Conrad Murray and what it reveals about Conrad Murray's intent. It's a very telling statement. His own words are that this is after 10 a.m. and he wants propofol. And Conrad Murray is not concerned, well, I'm going to give you 25 milligrams that will cause you to sleep for 5 or 7 minutes. Conrad Murray is concerned that he needs to be up no later than noon. If this is shortly after 10 a.m., that's potentially 2 hours into the future. And Conrad Murray's concerned, well, what about you need to be up at noon? Not 5 to 7 minutes from now, noon. Having that concern in mind, it is only after Michael Jackson says, well, they'll have to cancel it. Because clearly what Michael Jackson is requesting and clearly what Conrad Murray is intending on giving, if you believe this statement, is something that will cause him to sleep far past 12 o'clock. So it is only after Michael Jackson says they'll have to cancel it. In other words, I don't need to be up at noon. I can sleep past noon. That is when Conrad Murray says, so I agreed at that time that I would switch the over to the propofol. Only after it had been agreed that the rehearsal would be canceled, Michael would not need to be up at noon. That shows what was taking place. Not an intent to put him in a light sleep for 5 minutes, but an intent, as Nurse Lee said, to knock him out. If you believe he was even awake at this time and not already knocked out as a result of the propofol being given by Conrad Murray. So at 10:40 a.m., according to Conrad Murray, in response to that dialogue that the rehearsal will be canceled, he doesn't need to be up at noon, he then wants you to believe that he just gave 25 milligrams diluted with lidocaine, enough that would put him down for about 5 to 7 minutes or thereabout. Slowly infused, Jackson goes to sleep. Following the administration of the propofol,
watching for a long enough period that I felt comfortable. But then I needed to go to the bathroom. So I got up, went to the bathroom to release myself of the urine, and also consider getting rid of some of his urination that he had put in the jugs overnight. And then I came back to his bedside and I was stunned in the sense that he wasn't breathing.
he was gone for just 2 minutes. And when he came back, he finds Michael to be not breathing, but he checked the pulse oximeter, which displayed a heartbeat of 122. He additionally reached and checked Michael's femoral pulse. He felt a pulse, meaning that the heart was beating, but Michael was not breathing. This is the risk of propofol: airway obstruction, relaxation so that the tongue falls back and you stop breathing. That is why propofol administration, among a million other reasons, is so dangerous in this setting without the appropriate equipment. But by Conrad Murray's own words, Michael Jackson had stopped breathing but still had a heartbeat when he came back after just 2 minutes. And not only did he check it with the pulse oximeter, but he physically checked it as well. He does not call 911. And if you did not hear the audio of this as you sat in this trial, it would almost be completely unbelievable, the statements that Conrad Murray makes to justify his failure to do the most basic, the most common sense thing that we all learn as young children, that you call 911 immediately. He does not call 911 because to speak to a 911 operator would be to neglect Michael Jackson. To speak to a 911 operator was the only hope of Michael Jackson being revived to see another day. But Conrad Murray chose not to call 911 because Conrad Murray had other things on his mind, protecting Conrad Murray. So what does he do? He calls Michael Amir Williams. Does he ask Michael Amir Williams to call 911? No. He calls him at 12:12 p.m. We know he leaves a message on his phone. Setting aside all the other bizarre behavior on the part of Conrad Murray, setting everything else aside, he left a message on the voicemail. All he had to say was, call 911. We need a paramedic at Carrollwood. But he didn't say that. And he admits he didn't say that. I did not want him to. I couldn't ask him at that time to call 911 because he would want to know what it was about. And I have a patient that needs help, and I'm trying to assist. I'm trying to do it the best I can and try to get help. This is Conrad Murray's version of events prior to getting the voicemail recording and the phone records. You now know that Conrad Murray left a voicemail. Call me right away. Call me right away. He doesn't say call 911. Michael Amir Williams had no opportunity to ask questions if that was truly Conrad Murray's concern. He left a voicemail message. And he could have used that time to call 911. He should have used the time much earlier to call 911, but we know for a fact that at 12:12 he made this phone call to Michael Amir Williams and made no mention of 911 whatsoever. Because Conrad Murray knew what he had done. He knew what he had done. And he knew his acts killed Michael Jackson. Maybe he's panicked. Maybe he's still cleaning up. Maybe he's hoping some miracle befalls him and Michael Jackson is revived and no one will need to know about this. But he is putting Conrad Murray first. He is putting Conrad Murray first, and he's intentionally not calling 911. He's intentionally delaying the arrival of help that could have saved Michael Jackson's life. What do we learn then following this interview? Following defendant Murray's version of events, we learn a great deal. We learn about the telephone activity throughout the evening and during the relevant time period. And keep in mind when you try to link it up to his statements. We have here at 9:23, he's speaking to a Chanel Murray, and for 22 minutes. 22 minutes at 9:23 a.m. That takes you to 9:45 a.m. During this time, if you believe his interview, Michael's complaining. Michael needs to sleep. Michael continues to complain and complain and complain. He has a personal doctor there whose role is to give him propofol. And Conrad Murray would have you believe that Michael is complaining, asking to be put to sleep, but yet we know Conrad Murray is on the phone. Conrad Murray, for 22 minutes right there at 9:23, is on the phone. Do you really believe that with the anticipation that Conrad Murray is going to be paid $150,000 a month, and Michael is desperate for sleep, that Conrad Murray has left him there complaining and is just simply on the phone elsewhere? Or is it more reasonable that Michael Jackson is being infused and is in fact asleep, and Conrad Murray is going about his business of telephone calls, emails, text messages, social calls, business calls? This is 9:23 that takes us to 9:45. At 9:45 a.m., and you have the exhibit, but it's down here, we know there's a screenshot. What that means is at 9:45 a.m., Conrad Murray is looking at his phone, and this screenshot is on the phone. So he's gotten off the phone with Chanel. He's now checking his emails. Conrad Murray would have you believe that Michael Jackson is laying there complaining that he needs sleep while Conrad Murray does this. We know from the screenshot that there's this email from Bob Taylor regarding artist insurance. And we recover the email. And again, you'll have it in evidence. It can hardly be seen there. But it's a very lengthy, detailed email received at 5:54 a.m. Many questions, many concerns about getting insurance for the tour, many questions and many concerns about Michael's health condition. And we know through this email and through the expressions of concern for Michael's health, we know Conrad Murray read it because we have the screenshot here from his iPhone showing the same email is open and being read. This is following the 9:23 phone call. This is following the 9:45 screenshot showing that he opened the email, and then goes straight into additional phone calls. 10:14, 10:20. We also know he authored a response. We know he did this on his iPhone. This is a screenshot showing the keyboard, showing the text of the response. And we know that was eventually sent at 11:17 a.m. to Mr. Taylor. Not only does this reveal some of the activities of Conrad Murray during this time period, but again, it's the deception and the lies of Conrad Murray. We're on this very day, on June 25th, 2009, at 11:17 a.m., as Michael lay in bed under the influence of propofol and Valium and the other benzodiazepines, Conrad Murray is sending emails to people saying that the health concerns or the published accounts of Michael's health are fallacious. That was his word in the email. He's discounting any concerns regarding Michael's health. This is on June 25th at 11:17 a.m. that this email is sent from Conrad Murray's own iPhone. As far as the statements of his health published by the press, let me say they're all felicitous to the best of my knowledge. Sincerely, Conrad Murray, sent from my iPhone. And again, June 25th, 2009, 11:17 a.m. Despite his knowledge, despite everything everyone's told him, despite the May 10th recording, despite what he surely witnessed every single day, he is still basing his accounts on deception and lies. Because he is providing a service. He is an employee who is saying yes to what is asked instead of saying yes to what is best for Michael Jackson's health, as any competent, ethical doctor would do, premised on a doctor-patient relationship, not an employer-employee relationship. The phone calls continue. 11:18, there's a 32-minute phone call to his practice. There's a phone call to Bridget Morgan, Robert Russell, and then we get to the 11:51 a.m. phone call where he calls Sade Andy. And you have to ask, with Michael Jackson laying there in whatever condition he may have been at the moment, what was so important to Conrad Murray that he had to call Sade Anding at that time? What was so important to this doctor that he needed to call one of his female friends in Houston? What was so pressing that he just couldn't care for Michael Jackson that he had to call Sade Anding? We know from that call, after he calls Miss Anding, she's talking away and she says about 5 minutes into the phone call, I'm getting no response. I'm saying things, he's not responding. I hear some muffled coughing or noises in the background. She can't make out who it is or what it is. She eventually hangs up. She tries to reach Conrad Murray via, I believe, text and phone call, and is not able to make contact with him. Circumstantially, this may be the moment Conrad Murray finds Michael Jackson not breathing. It directly contradicts Conrad Murray's statement to the police that he went to the bathroom for 2 minutes and came back and found him not breathing. But circumstantially, this may establish when Conrad Murray found Michael Jackson in bed. How long Michael Jackson was there by himself, abandoned, not breathing, we'll never know. What you could circumstantially conclude is this was when Conrad Murray gave just an ounce of attention to Michael Jackson to see what his condition was. But again, how long he had been in that condition, we'll never know. Was Conrad Murray in another room? Did Michael Jackson yell out for help? Did he gasp? Did he choke? Were there sounds? We don't know. And we'll never know. Because of the neglect and negligence of Conrad Murray. Following this, we know, again, based on the phone records, that there's a 1212 phone call to Michael Amir Williams, which we already discussed. Doesn't tell him to call 911. It's 1215 return call from Michael Amir Williams, where he actually speaks to Conrad Murray. Following up on the 1213 voicemail message. Conrad Murray tells in the message again, call me right away, please, please, call me right away. Thank you. You've heard that message and you have it in evidence. When he calls back, he speaks to Conrad Murray at 12:15 p.m. based on Conrad Murray telling him he needs to get to the house. He makes a series of phone calls. He reaches Fahim Muhammad, who's run to the bank and is a few minutes away. He tells Fahim, double back to the house. He says, I will, but I am a few minutes away. He eventually makes contact with Alberto Alvarez, who is in the security shack, and tells Alberto Alvarez, start walking toward the house, and he's talking on the phone as he's doing this. And Alberto Alvarez proceeds to the glass doors that were shown to you earlier. Michael Amir Williams is saying, you know, don't raise too much concern, but walk quickly. Okay, get going, get going. Alberto Alvarez goes to the door. He looks up and he sees Conrad Murray leaning over the banister. He sees, I believe, the nanny and Paris in the foyer area. He gets into the house. He's still on the phone. He goes upstairs, and he eventually terminates a phone call with Michael Amir Williams. We know he goes into the bedroom, and as he's in the room, he walks in, you know, essentially, what happened? And what he hears are cries behind him. What he hears is Paris screaming out, "Daddy." So he quickly turns and ushers Paris out of the room. He comes back in, and Conrad Murray is over on the far side of the bed. He's grabbing vials, and he instructs Alberto, pick up that bag. Drops the vials into the bag, and those are put into one of Conrad Murray's, evidently one of his medical bags. He then tells him, grab that saline bag. And remember, there's 2 saline bags hanging from the IV stand. There's 2 saline bags. And he specifically instructs him, grab that one. The one Alberto Alvarez describes as having a bottle inside of it. He's never told to grab the other saline bag. He's told specifically to grab the one that Alberto Alvarez saw a bottle within. I asked Alberto Alvarez, what was going on in your head at this time? What were you thinking? He thought he was helping the doctor prepare to go to the hospital to save Michael Jackson's life. That's what he thought they were doing. We have the People's 30, the bottle. Alyssa Fleet testified to recovering it. She testified to the bottle being inside the saline bag. She testified that that's the very reason it was laid on top of the saline bag to document. She testified that it had been removed from the bag for purposes of photography, and that that's the bottle and the bag that she had recovered from inside the blue Costco bag. Only after these events take place, only after Alberto Alvarez is told to open up the bag so the vials could be dropped into it, and only after Alberto Alvarez is told to remove the saline bag, the cut-open saline bag from the IV stand, only then does Conrad Murray tell Alberto Alvarez to call 911. Not at 11:56 when Sade Anding notes a problem. Not at 12:12 when Conrad Murray calls Michael Amir Williams and leaves a voicemail message. Not at 12:15 when Michael Amir Williams calls back and talks personally to Conrad Murray. But I believe the defense evidence from the Beverly Hills PD was at 12:20 and I believe 18 seconds. Some 20-plus minutes after, from the defense own theory as presented to you, Michael Jackson was found not breathing in bed. You heard from Fahim Muhammad. He comes up to the room after 911 had been called. And he comes in. He hears Paris and Prince outside of the room in the landing area where they'd been ushered out by Alberto Alvarez. He goes to the children. He finds Paris balled up on the floor, crying. Prince standing still, shocked, crying. And he quickly takes the children. He gets the nanny because he wants to escort the children downstairs so they don't have to witness what is transpiring. Paramedics respond, and we know from paramedic Senef that they're about 1.5 miles away. It took them just a little over 4 minutes to get to the location. 1.5 miles. Think of that when you're thinking about the time sequence of when the 911 call could have been made and when the 911 call was made. And what on earth would motivate a medical doctor to delay making that call other than to protect himself, other than sheer self-preservation, putting Conrad Murray first, putting Michael Jackson, his life, last. That is what transpired. And that is what Conrad Murray did. The paramedics arrive, and we know about the care they gave, the resuscitative efforts they took. We know about the basic life support that paramedic Blunt did as just a matter of routine because he knows what he's doing. He talks about the chin lifts, the head tilt, the tongue suppressor, the basic life support measures you've heard about throughout this trial. And paramedic Blunt was able to do that right away. Unfortunately, it was too late. He talks about the advanced life support, using the endotracheal tube to ventilate the patient. Equipment that could have been there within about 4 minutes of a 911 call had Conrad Murray chosen to make such a call when this first transpired. But again, we don't know how long Michael Jackson lay there in bed before Conrad Murray even found him. Maybe it was already well too late. The paramedics did everything they could. We know through their testimony that after Michael Jackson was transferred via gurney down to the rig, that paramedic Senef returned upstairs to the bedroom to get his equipment. And you think of this scenario, you think of what is transpiring, you think about what had just taken place with the children crying, them trying to rush Michael Jackson to the hospital. And what he finds is Conrad Murray's up in the room alone, appears to be picking things up, and he's holding a trash bag. And he seems surprised. Paramedic Senef gets his equipment, gathers up his belongings, and goes back downstairs, leaving Conrad Murray, again, still up in the room alone. Conrad Murray, sometime shortly thereafter, then comes down the stairs, enters the rig, and is driven to UCLA with the emergency personnel. Conrad Murray, again, you'll have this photograph in evidence, and it'll be much clearer when you have it back there with you. And what you'll see depicted in this picture is Conrad Murray standing here with these beige pants and a white T-shirt. And what you'll see when you look at the photograph closer is there are these large, loose cargo pants with cargo pockets on the sides. And you can actually see in the photograph, this left leg here, there's a big cargo pocket on the left side of the pant leg. You'll have an opportunity to view that photograph and draw your own conclusions. But it documents what Conrad Murray was wearing, that he had these large pockets on both sides of his pants. You also have the photographs of Conrad Murray in the viewing area. If you recall some of those photographs, black and white photographs of Conrad Murray in the viewing area, where he's wearing the same clothing. So what happens at UCLA? Again, Dr. Cooper and Dr. Wynn are told between the two of them that Conrad Murray had been giving Valium and Flomax over a period of time, but when they asked specifically what had he been given this night, what have you given him, the only thing he said was lorazepam. Dr. White will tell you that he simply overlooked the propofol. He overlooked the propofol. Propofol is never mentioned, either Dr. Cooper or Dr. Wynn. They do everything they can, but it's far too late to save the life of Michael Jackson. We also learn from Michael Amir Williams and Fahim Mohammed that following the pronouncement of death of Michael Jackson, that Conrad Murray asked if he could be taken back to the home because he needed to recover some cream that Michael would not want the world to know about. They both found this odd, and they came up together with a story to say that the police had taken their car keys. That way they simply wouldn't have to involve themselves with it. They could politely say no, they have no choice. But think about the thought process of Conrad Murray at this time. What does he know? He knows his medical bags with the propofol and the other items are still in the house. He knows that People's 30, with his fingerprint on it, is still at the house. He knows his 3 various medical bags, syringes, and various items are still at the house. Do you really think he was worried at that time that Michael would be concerned about a Benequin cream? that he had vitiligo and he had to use a medically necessary cream? Do you really think that was Conrad Murray's concern at that time? Conrad Murray had concerns. Conrad Murray's concern, as it was throughout this time period, was Conrad Murray. That was his concern. But they did not take him back to the house. And we know sometime thereafter, Conrad Murray left the hospital after being involved with a press release and things of that nature. He left the hospital and apparently was not seen, at least at the hospital, again that day. I want to talk about the discovery of the bags up in the cabinet. And we know that that discovery occurred as a result of Conrad Murray telling the police about it in his interview of June 27, 2009. But what's interesting to note when you listen to the audio and you read the transcript and you take into account the testimony of Detective Scott Smith, Conrad Murray went into this interview thinking the bags had been discovered. When you piece together all the evidence, Conrad Murray knew the police had been there. He knew there was eventually going to be toxicology findings. He went into this interview to get ahead of the story. He went into this interview to get his version of events out there before the police discovered it on their own, and he looked even more guilty. This was a calculated plan. He assumed the police had found those bags in that upper cabinet. So the interview takes place, but what is said? Detective Smith, where's your bag with those syringes? Where's your bag where those syringes would be at now? Mr. Chernoff, oh really? Dr. Murray, I don't have them. Mr. Chernoff, I thought you left it there. Dr. Murray, yeah, I did. Detective Smith, where? Where did you leave it? Dr. Murray, in that same bedroom, in the closet, where it always stays. Conrad Murray thought the police was already in custody of those bags. He's coming forward to this interview for the self-preservation of Conrad Murray, to get ahead of the story, to put his version out there. Unfortunately, his version doesn't match up with any of the evidence. It doesn't match up with the phone records, or the text messages, or the emails. Conrad Murray put this out there because he thought the bags had already been discovered, and he knew the toxicology findings, when linked to what was found in those bags, would show that Michael Jackson died of acute propofol intoxication coupled with the contributory effect of the benzodiazepines. I want to talk about the standard of care. Should I continue, Your Honor, through?
Please.
Okay. The standard of care, ladies and gentlemen. You heard from a number of doctors in this case. The people called Dr. Alon Steinberg, Dr. Nader Kamangar, and Dr. Steve Schaefer. Dr. Alon Steinberg is a board-certified cardiologist. Nader Kamangar is a sleep expert, critical care medicine, internal medicine, pulmonary specialist. Dr. Steve Schaefer is one of the leading anesthesiologists, an expert in pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And you heard from this cross-section of experts who came in here and told you about the standard of care, what is needed, what are the dangers, what is required. Every single doctor that testified in this courtroom told you they would never do what Conrad Murray did. Every single doctor. Because they know it could lead to death. So what did we learn? We learned that the standard of care for propofol requires a room that looks like this. A medical facility. Whether it's a hospital, a surgery suite, a medical clinic, a medical facility that has the necessary equipment, that has the personnel, that has the resuscitative equipment, that has the resuscitative drugs. This is where propofol is used. Not here. Not in an upstairs bedroom without any of such necessary equipment and care. So we know what propofol does. We know it's only used in a highly monitored setting. And we know without doubt from the people's experts that the setting represents an extreme violation of the standard of care. This is basic common sense. There's no backup. There's no emergency equipment. Propofol is not utilized in a bedroom. No one had ever heard of propofol being used in a bedroom ever until Conrad Murray did it to Michael Jackson. It's an egregious, extreme deviation from the standard of care. It is gross negligence, and it is a direct cause of Michael Jackson's death, the setting in which this was done. Had it been done in a hospital, you have the emergency equipment. You have what you need. You have personnel. You have airway management tools. This is criminal negligence, criminal gross negligence. But we know there's multiple violations of the standard of care. We know it's not indicated for the treatment of insomnia. And you remember Dr. White put forth, or Mr. Flanagan asked the people's experts about this insomnia study. I believe it was out of Taiwan. And this post-dated Michael Jackson's death, number one. Number two, the authors of that study called it an experiment, and it needed to be further researched. It had multiple safety precautions in place, such as all the monitoring, the fasting, the exclusion of other drugs, IRB ethical approval for the study. So it was done in a setting where it had all the necessary precautions, but the authors of that study said it's an absolute experiment and needs to be studied further. It does not create a standard of care. It didn't even exist in June 2009. Propofol is in no way indicated for the treatment of insomnia. What the experts testified to is what Conrad Murray was doing was a pharmaceutical experiment on Michael Jackson. It was an experiment. If 2010 it's studied for insomnia, if in 2010 it's an experiment, it surely was an obscene experiment on June 25th, 2009 by a doctor who has no knowledge or basis of training in sleep medicine. This is an extreme deviation. This is gross criminal negligence. Continuous medical monitoring equipment. You heard a great deal about the heart monitors that are needed, the pulse oximetry, the capnography, the blood pressure. All of these things need to be constantly monitored because we know from every expert, called by the defense or the people, that bad things can happen quickly when you're using propofol. Propofol is a wonderful drug if used appropriately. Bad things can happen quickly. Respiratory depression and death if you don't know what you're doing and you're not in the appropriate setting with the appropriate equipment. This is criminal negligence. Immediate access and the ability to use resuscitative equipment. This includes the drugs, a crash cart, defibrillator, suction apparatus, as well as the airway equipment that paramedic Blunt was able to utilize. But you don't just need to have it, you need to be able to use it. And I reference that being the ambu bag laying on the floor, which Conrad Murray never makes any mention of using. We know from the Seacoast records it hadn't even been ordered until some time, I believe in June. But you have the records back in the deliberation room. But he says he went straight to compressions and mouth-to-mouth, never once mentioning the ambu bag. No suction apparatus, no crash cart with the necessary drugs, no automatic defibrillator, none of the airway equipment one would need and require in order to safely manage an emergency as a result of propofol. This clearly is criminal gross negligence and extreme deviation from the standard of care. It requires continuous presence and monitoring. Abandonment of a patient, including just preoccupation with phone calls, texts, and emails, is abandonment of a patient. Leaving the room is obviously even worse. But you need constant visual observation of your patient. You do not leave your patient alone in this condition. There's a fundamental principle. If your concern is the patient's life, you do not leave them alone. That's why in the hospital setting we learn they have the backup personnel, all the audible equipment, all the equipment available, including people, including eyes on the patient, because bad things happen very, very quickly. Extreme criminal gross negligence. The contributory factor of the benzodiazepines. Again, in this setting, this only heightened the danger. In a hospital setting, you may be able to use benzodiazepines and propofol, but in this setting, everything is exacerbated. Everything is heightened. The risk of respiratory failure is heightened because the benzodiazepines are already working. They're already in the blood. You know, Dr. White talked about all these variables. The reason you take the precautions you take is because you can't always predict how an individual patient will react. You can't always predict exactly how dehydrated that patient is. You can't always predict exactly the level of the benzodiazepines at a given moment. As the defense spent a great time explaining, there are variables. That is why you take the precautions you do. You don't have time to go back after the fact to say, you know what, I should have had that emergency equipment there. It's too late. Michael's dead. You take the precautions up front if you put the patient first. This, in and of itself, is an extreme violation, and the coroner found contributed to his death. The contributory benzodiazepine effect that exacerbated the propofol. Written informed consent, again, required to explain to the patient the risks involved and the benefits involved, the risks and the complications that may ensue. Is criminal negligence. Charting and documenting all vital records. Again, there wouldn't be so many theories about exactly what happened behind closed doors if it had simply been documented. Conrad Murray was all too willing to record Michael Jackson on May 10th on his iPhone, but not a single piece of paper documenting the dosages, the vital signs, the amount of propofol, the times propofol was given, the times the lorazepam or midazolam or Valium was given. Not one piece of paper. And think about that, because there were medical records for prior time periods. Conrad Murray did have medical records for Michael Jackson in 06 or 07 or 08. He was willing to chart medical records. He was capable of charting medical records. He chose not to keep medical records because he didn't want to document this pharmaceutical experiment he was conducting. And that is what it was. There was no precedence for this. There was no literature to support this. There is a lack of medical records because Conrad Murray chose there to be a lack of medical records, because he did not want to document what he was doing with Mr. Jackson. If nothing else, it reflects on the consciousness of guilt, the knowledge of Conrad Murray of what he was doing to Michael Jackson in this bizarre treatment. But it is criminal negligence either way. The 911 call. Again, you learn this as children. This is basic common sense. The first thing you do. Now, Conrad Murray, as a doctor, should have assessed the patient. He should have quickly assessed the patient, seen what's going on, and called 911. We know he's capable of making a phone call. If he wants to say it was, he couldn't do it at the same time, then you put it on speakerphone. But we know at 12:12 he made a phone call and did not ask for 911. This is bizarre behavior from anyone, let alone a doctor. This extreme criminal negligence. We talked about the doctor-patient relationship and how this was not a doctor-patient relationship. This was an employer-employee relationship. And that fundamental corruption of that relationship forms the foundation of every single act that Conrad Murray took. because he was not acting as a doctor with Michael's best interests at heart. He was not acting as an informed medical doctor trying to put his patient first. He deceived the paramedics. Again, that relates to the consciousness of guilt, but it's criminal negligence, it's unethical, it's unconscionable. He deceived UCLA medical personnel. Again, it's consciousness of guilt, but it's also unethical, unconscionable, and an extreme deviation from the standard of care. Now, we heard also about these simulations, and I want to talk about this briefly. You heard from Dr. Steve Schaefer, one of the premier experts in computer modeling and computer simulations. And there is some speculation as to what transpired. Because we have no medical records, Michael Jackson is dead. So working backwards, Dr. Schaefer tried to piece together the most likely scenario. Based on the science, based on the prior conduct of Conrad Murray, based on the evidence recovered at the scene, and in Dr. Schaefer's expert opinion, who is well published in pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, anesthesiologist at Columbia University, just received a lifetime award in his field. Based on the blood levels and all the available evidence, the most likely scenario to him is that an infusion was running. Nothing extraordinary or unusual about that. That is what Conrad Murray said he had done nearly every night for the past 2 months. An infusion was running. At some point, respiratory depression took hold. Michael stopped breathing. And at some point along that continuum of time, while the infusion is still dripping into him, he dies. And in that scenario, it explains the femoral blood levels of 2.6. But what we also know is that it's based on the propofol shipments, these massive amounts of propofol that are being shipped to Conrad Murray at his girlfriend's apartment. It's based on the prior conduct that Conrad Murray, he himself states he was doing, 50 milligram boluses followed by a drip on all these prior occasions. And it's based on People's 30 and People's 29, the cut saline bag. Now think about People's 30 for a moment. Again, this is the one that has Conrad Murray's fingerprint on it. It is a stipulated fact. It is a fact that this label, this hanging tab, was unused and intact on June 25th, 2009. Now, they tend to reapply themselves, but this is a fact that has been stipulated by the people and the defense, that this hanging tab was unused and intact on June 25th, 2009. Well, Dr. White himself testified that this is a spike hole on top, that this hole is from a spike, an infusion line spike. This bottle was hung upside down with a spike in it. And it's a stipulated fact that this plastic hanging tab was unused and intact on June 25th, 2009. Does it seem that extraordinary or unusual that this had been placed in the cut saline bag that Alberto Alvarez saw and that Alyssa Fleek recovered from the blue Costco bag? This plastic tab was not used. This, according to Dr. White, is a spike hole. This was spiked with an infusion line. It had to have been upside down to drain through that spike hole. The only reasonable interpretation of the evidence is that it was because it was hanging in that saline bag. Now, if you remember in the interview of Conrad Murray relates that Michael Jackson always wanted him to put the things away. He wanted him to put his bags up in the cabinet. Conrad Murray says Michael Jackson told him where to put them in that upper cabinet because he didn't want things laying around. Maybe this was Michael Jackson's idea, that somehow this would conceal it a little bit to be inside of a bag. Not very well. We don't know. there are no medical records, and Michael Jackson is dead. But it is a fact that that tab was not used. It is a fact, according to Dr. White himself, that a spike, an infusion spike, was put into that bottle, and we know that the bottle is essentially empty and has been drained through a spike hole as it hung upside down. And we also know that bottle has the fingerprint of Conrad Murray. So when the defense questioned Dr. Schaefer about this extraordinary interpretation of the facts, this is what Conrad Murray was doing every night, according to himself. Running an infusion, a drip, he called it. 50 milligram bolus followed by a drip. And it explains the blood levels. It's consistent with, if you look at the phone records of what Conrad Murray was doing, if you believe that at 9:20 he's on the phone doing emails, Michael Jackson's not laying there complaining about sleep. Conrad Murray would have to just literally be ignoring him then. Conrad Murray's his employee. You'd have to believe that Michael's laying there saying, "Doctor, put me to sleep," and Conrad Murray's just either not in the room at all or just ignoring him, making phone calls, sending text messages, reading emails. The likely scenario is Michael Jackson was asleep, hooked up to this drip, and Conrad Murray grew so distracted, was either in the room, out of the room. Dr. White says, under his scenario where Michael self-injected, Dr. White says he doesn't believe that was during the 2-minute time period. He thinks it was an altogether different time period of abandonment. Let alone their theory that Michael Jackson swallowed lorazepam pills, which would be altogether another time period of abandonment. Dr. Schaefer is the expert in the field. And based on the available evidence and the lack of medical records and the shipments and everything else I just recounted, it is a reasonable interpretation of what happened. But that may be a question that always remains unanswered. It may always remain unanswered how exactly that transpired in that private bedroom. But what you will know, based on the evidence in this case, is that Conrad Murray was a substantial factor in Michael's death as a result of everything we've talked about, and that Michael Jackson died as a result of propofol intoxication. So what did we hear from the defense? Well, we heard from a number of character witnesses. 5 different people came in and praised Conrad Murray. And there's a few important things to note. I'm certain they believed every word they said. They probably got good care. They were all treated in hospitals for something Conrad Murray is trained to do, hearts. They all had heart troubles. They were treated in a hospital. They were given stents. I think it was Andrew Guest who said there was a whole team of people helping. There were heart monitors. There was paperwork that had to be filled out. There were other personnel. There was equipment. And it was for their heart, something Conrad Murray is trained, evidently, to do. But even setting that aside, there are a few things to note about these witnesses. Number one, we didn't really hear about any witnesses that were under his current care and received those letters in the mail and told he would no longer be their doctor. Gary Cossey had a heart attack in 2000. I believe Andrew Guest had a heart problem in 2002. Dennis Hicks, 1999 or 2000. Ruby Mosley, I think in 2003. Miss Sampson, she did have a heart attack in 1995, then eventually was treated by Conrad Murray, which is interesting because Conrad Murray, she pointed out, was able to review the prior doctor's medical records in making his decision, because the prior doctor kept medical records. And then she did say she had an incident in 2008 and 2009, but it was not clear from her testimony that that was in any way that she was left to fend for herself as Conrad Murray decided to take this position with Michael Jackson. But you did hear from a patient who is currently in active treatment from Conrad Murray at this time, and that was Robert Russell, if you remember. He was one of the phone calls during the time Conrad Murray was at 100 North Carrollwood. And Robert Russell said he got good treatment for his heart from Conrad Murray, but that he, in the midst of treatment and tests and waiting for results, not not someone a decade prior or even months prior, but someone who was in the midst of treatment and concerned about his life, concerned about his heart and the test results, he felt completely abandoned and let loose by Conrad Murray. That was an existing patient under the care of Conrad Murray. But all the character witness the defense called, of all the patients Conrad Murray must have treated for heart troubles, they chose to call people who were not currently under the care of Conrad Murray. They were friends, they liked him, but there was no pending test result, no pending stent operation about which they testified. Then the defense called a number of witnesses. They called Dr. Metzger. Dr. Metzger came in to testify about Michael Jackson's prior request for an IV sleep aid. Dr. Metzger and these other witnesses enlightened us on the standard of care and some of the issues that are relevant in this case. Dr. Metzger told us,
is there any amount of money that you would have that would have convinced you to give him intravenous propofol in his house?
Absolutely not.
absolutely not. It's not a shocking statement. It's a predictable statement. Of course he wouldn't. Nobody would. No one ever has. Until Conrad Murray. We heard from Nurse Lee, who shared with us that Michael told her, no, it's safe. It's safe as long as a doctor is monitoring me. The doctor told me it's safe as long as I am monitored.
He said, doctors have told me that it's safe. I just need to be monitored.
That was Michael's state of mind. Nobody's disputing that he wanted the propofol. But he also wanted a doctor there. I'm sure Michael Jackson had the means and resources to get propofol if he really needed to. There is no evidence that Michael Jackson ever sought out or did such a thing without having a medical doctor present. Michael Jackson was not reckless. Michael Jackson had a life ahead of him. Michael Jackson had 3 children that he loved dearly. He wanted propofol to help him sleep. He wanted a doctor with eyes on him to make sure he was safe. Dr. Waldman came in evidently to testify about Demerol. But Dr. Waldman also told us some useful information. And that is that lorazepam is a controlled narcotic controlled by the DEA, and it needs to be kept under lock and key when a doctor has assumed the medical care of a patient. He also told us about the requirement for medical records. And if you recall, I think in my question I asked him if it was required for 3 years, and he said, actually, I think it's 7 years when dispensing controlled substances, of which lorazepam is a controlled substance.
Dr. Waldman, would you agree with the statement as it relates to controlled substances? That state and federal laws require physicians to maintain adequate and accurate medical records. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
And also, as put out by the Medical Board of California, would you agree with this statement as it relates to controlled substances, that a physician is required to keep drugs in a securely locked and substantially constructed cabinet or safe?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Locked up. And medical records kept, documenting which drugs were dispensed. We don't have a single record of any lorazepam being dispensed other than the shipment records from Tim Lopez from the pharmacy. We have Dr. Paul White. And Dr. White was a very notable person in the field of anesthetics. He did do early research into the clinical use of propofol. Dr. Schaefer has been his colleague and friend for many years. Dr. White is now retired. And what you were presented from Dr. White was junk science. It was disappointing. Dr. Schaefer said it was disappointing. It was garbage science. And it's sad that Dr. White came in here for whatever motive he may have had, whether there are financial considerations that he did not share, we don't know. But the foundation of trust between a patient and doctor, that theme extends to the ability to trust science. That it's backed up by academic rigor and testing and data. And that there are principles, fundamental principles of science and truth-seeking behind the science. What Dr. White came in and did was sad for science and sad for truth-seeking. Dr. White came in here, and we know from his first report, inexplicably, he doesn't want to call it a report, he wants to call it a letter. It's a report that was provided to the people in discovery that laid out his opinions in this case. And from day one, there's only been one consistency from Dr. White. There's been only one thing that he is consistent about. That however he stretches the science, however he stretches the research, however he obscures the literature, he's going to find a way to blame this death on Michael Jackson. He's going to find a theory or way to blame it on Michael Jackson. That is, until it's debunked by Dr. Steve Schaefer, at which point he'll pick a new theory to blame it on Michael Jackson. So in his March 8, 2011 report, he speculates, he said it was just a speculative thought that he was sharing, that Michael Jackson either drank the propofol or self-injected it. Quickly, he, in April, receives Dr. Steve Schaefer's report. Based on fundamental principles of first-pass effect and what the liver does to propofol when it's orally ingested, Dr. Schaefer concluded that was impossible. Impossible. That's in his report of April 18th. It's impossible. Based on things that first-year medical students know. What your liver does to the oral ingestion of an agent such as propofol, it's impossible that Michael Jackson died as a result of oral ingestion of propofol. So when Dr. White learns of Dr. Schaefer's report, evidently starts backtracking. But how does he do it? Well, according to the direct examination by Mr. Flanagan, he states he wanted to do his own research. And he suggested that we commission a study in animals. And we did this study. We didn't publish it because I didn't think it was necessarily appropriate for publication. It was negative. The drug that was given directly into the stomach was absorbed and metabolized, and there was no effect. Well, in cross-examination, we learn that this wasn't what you would expect from his testimony as some sort of commissioned official study subject to peer review with data to look at. No, he says, Mr. Flanagan stated that he knew a vet in Indiana who could conduct the study. I did not directly participate. Well, did you review any data or were you provided any reports in regard to that study? No formal report. Only an oral report that had no effect, which confirmed what my suspicion was, and it confirmed what Dr. Schaefer had proposed. And who provided you with this oral report? Mr. Flanagan, this is the level of academic research and rigor that Dr. White sullied this trial with. He essentially has Mr. Flanagan call a guy he knows in Indiana, does some study, and then concludes it's not orally bioavailable, which everyone knew. But that's what, during direct examination, you would have believed that he had commissioned a study, he got results, and they chose not to publish it because the results were fairly predictable. He had nothing to do with the study. According to him, it was Mr. Flanagan. It's important and it's relevant as to the level of trust or credence you should give to any of Dr. White's opinions in this case at this point. What else did we learn from Dr. White? We certainly learned that he wouldn't administer propofol in a home.
If Michael Jackson had come to you, Dr. White, and indicated that he would like to hire you to administer propofol to him, to put him to sleep each night in his bedroom, would you do it?
Absolutely not. That would be a job that I would never consider.
Dr. White told us about the need to call 911.
As I said earlier, I think he should have called 911 sooner.
Dr. White told us about the administration of propofol in a bedroom.
Well, I would not administer propofol in a bedroom, as I stated earlier.
Dr. White, after some back and forth questioning, admitted that a pulse oximeter without an alarm when you're not present is utterly useless.
I'm asking about a pulse oximeter without an alarm. If you are not there to see it, to see the little tiny screen, and you're not there to hear it, it doesn't even have an alarm, what value does it serve?
Well, only
In your absence, what value does it serve in your absence?
in your absence, it probably has little, if any, value.
None, correct?
Well, yeah, that's true.
Okay, it has no value, correct? If you're not in the room. Correct?
Correct, yeah.
It has no value. No value. We learned Dr. White's opinion regarding abandonment of a patient, particularly one who's evidently someone who likes to push propofol.
Would you walk out of the room and leave them alone with no personnel and no monitoring if you're of the opinion they like to push propofol themselves? Would you walk out of the room in that situation, yes or no?
No, I would not leave the room.
What else do we learn from Dr. White? Well, he came in here. He came in here and talked about scenarios he created, or a Dr. Ornelas created, rather. On direct examination by Mr. Flanagan, it appeared Dr. White was an expert in this field, that he knew pharmacokinetics, and that he was prepared to opine based on these charts and graphs and simulations. Dr. White testified specifically to the defense exhibit, and under questioning by Mr. Flanagan noted the scenario that we have up here, does it reconcile with the urine evidence? Yes. And you remember Dr. White testified repeatedly. His main concern were these urine results. He wanted to get to the bottom of these urine results. On cross-examination, he's asked, I know you indicated Dr. Ornelas is the one who created this, but were you providing her data, information, upon which she would base the simulation? I did not provide her really any guidance whatsoever. She was watching the proceedings on television. That is the science, alleged science, that you're being given by the defense in this case. Junk science.
Mr. Walgren, do let us know for purposes of the luncheon recess when it's convenient.
If about 10 more minutes, then I'll be...
I have a feeling we should take the break. Will it be 10?
I think so, Your Honor.
What do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Would you like a break, or do you want to go to 10? You sure? You know, I was raised on this issue of always questioning authority, so. You all right?
Okay, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Cross-examination on this issue. Dr. White, in the article upon which you based your testimony, as far as the 0.3% published in 1988, the author there was Simons. Correct. And you felt that was the most accurate accounting of unchanged propofol in the urine? Actually, I didn't make that determination. Dr. Ornelas is the one who did the pharmacokinetic modeling. She is the one with expertise, not me. Did you read this article, Dr. White? I did look over the article. I didn't really analyze it. I looked at the article. I didn't read it in detail. No. How many hours did you put into collaboration with Dr. Ornelas prior to your testifying so you were competently informed as to the data and the literature that you were relying upon? I had a conversation with her. She came over to the house I was staying at, the Flanagan's house, and presented. Mr. Flanagan's house? Yes. His response further on in the transcript, page 9451 and 9452. But again, as I testified, I'm not the expert in the pharmacokinetic modeling. I did not make those graphs. Dr. Ornelas chose the time. I don't know how she decided to put the time of the bolus dose where it was on the graph. The reason I asked her to provide these was because I was interested in knowing about the urine. That is the primary thing. And here we may agree. If there was a vast difference in the urine, amount of the urine content, then it would suggest one model might be more accurate than the other. Dr. White, cross-examination. Dr. White, referring to the 1988 Simons article, it indicates that cyclohexane extractable radioactivity in urine. What is that? I'm not an expert in this area, so I really don't feel comfortable commenting on it. Going on. I really do not feel comfortable commenting on an article that is outside my area of expertise and which I have not been able to carefully analyze it or sit down and analyze with someone who has the expertise to do so. So in a matter of a day, Dr. White came in here and presented himself as an expert in this field and was then running so far away from it, you could hardly keep track of him. He absolutely disowned these simulations. He attributed it all to this Dr. Ornelas that he had a conversation with at Mr. Flanagan's house. And it shows the same standard, the lack of academic rigor, the lack of any research, the lack of seeking the truth that he had displayed in blaming Michael Jackson for orally ingesting propofol the first go-around. And then this issue of oral lorazepam, if you recall through the questioning by Mr. Flanagan, a number of witnesses were presented with a hypothetical about a supposed 10 a.m. oral ingestion of lorazepam. That was presented numerous times. Why? As the defense elicited, there's a 2-hour peak in lorazepam. So the defense wanted a 10 a.m. ingestion of lorazepam so that at noon the drugs are at their highest peak, and as Mr. Chernoff said in his opening statement, there would be a perfect storm. And Michael Jackson recklessly grabbed the propofol syringe and injected himself. But as we know, Dr. Schaefer came in and discussed the absorption times as it relates to the stomach. And there would have to be at least 4 hours prior to noon. So what do we get in these new simulations by Dr. White, or rather Dr. Ornelas? A 7 a.m. ingestion. So the lorazepam theory changed. The oral propofol theory changed. The urine theory was based on an old, outdated 1988 article, and we know for a fact from Dr. White's own words, he did nothing to validate, research, or confirm. What he did do is blame it all on this Dr. Ornelas. One area I asked Dr. White about, and it seemed like a pretty simple question, was the tiny nature of the XL infusion kit, that I could ball it up in my hand, could easily fit in a pocket. It was a very small item. It's not unreasonable to think that might have been carried out of the house. It's not unreasonable to think Conrad Murray didn't get everything and wanted to go back and attribute it to retrieving a cream. But I asked Dr. White if this was an easily concealable item. He acknowledged it was, but he didn't feel all that comfortable doing so.
Would you agree that this is very compact and would be easily concealable? Would you agree with that statement?
I guess, I don't know what you mean by easily conceivable. I mean,
Well, it could be slipped into a pocket, right?
Presumably, yes.
Presumably, yes.
You have another IV line?
Yes.
You have another IV line?
Yes.
You have another IV line?
Yes.
You should have another IV.
The XL infusion line fits readily in a pocket. Lastly, you heard from Dr. Steve Schaefer, came in briefly on rebuttal. And you recall he had done the demonstration earlier showing the propofol bottle in the bag. It had drained just fine, controlling the roller clamps, as he explained. He explained how Michael Jackson died of respiratory failure. He explained how the standards of care, if you're going to rely on office-based standard of care, certainly if there's this new theory by Dr. White of bedroom-based anesthesia, you would require even greater care because you're in a remote location without, again, all the backup and there's no room for error. But specifically, as Dr. White hung his hat on the urine results to demonstrate his scenario as opposed to Dr. Schaefer's, and said that the urine results would show which one was more plausible as it related to the other, Dr. Schaefer, who is a scientist, who does do research and is transparent, explained that the Simons article, there was so little unchanged propofol in the urine that they did not even measure it. In fact, that's why they had to say, well, it would be less than 0.3%, and could be as low as 0, but categorically less than 0.3%. He then researched all the literature, all the articles, and found the definitive article, which cited Simons. But this is a 2002 article. And it wasn't critical of Simons. Simons simply didn't have the equipment and the sophisticated testing equipment back in 1988 that they do now in 2002. And the 2002 article found that the measurement would be 0.004% and equates the amount of excreted unchanged propofol being, if it's 70.71, if that is the amount of unchanged propofol in the urine, the mean dosage of propofol was 2,003 milligrams. 2,003 milligrams to result in 70.71 unchanged propofol. Well, Michael Jackson had 82.5 unchanged propofol. Dr. Schaefer opined that based on the mean averages, if anything, this article and this research absolutely confirms Dr. Schaefer's finding of at least a 1,000 milligram bottle draining into his body, and it absolutely debunks the defense scenario based on the very thing Dr. White said he was hanging his hat on, and that is the unchanged propofol levels in the urine. Ladies and gentlemen, this rules out the defense self-administration theory and fully supports the hypothesis put forward by Dr. Schaefer. I know I've talked for some time, and I appreciate you allowing me to continue and wrap it up. You have heard a lot of evidence from a lot of witnesses. And as I said at the outset of this, this morning, Michael Jackson trusted Conrad Murray. He trusted him with his life. He paid with his life. Conrad Murray, in multiple instances, deceived, lied, obscured, but more importantly, Conrad Murray acted with criminal negligence. Conrad Murray looked out for himself and himself alone. He wanted this employment. He didn't want to lose the employment, so he had to say yes. But that's not what a doctor does. That is not what a doctor does. That is antithetical to the legal obligation, the ethical obligation, the legal duty of a doctor. Conrad Murray's actions directly caused the death of Michael Jackson. But the people do not need to prove that. All that needs to be proven to find criminal liability on the part of Dr. Murray is that he was a substantial factor in the death. And as it relates to any intervening causation, as I already explained, it was not extraordinary, it was not unforeseeable. Even if you accept the defense version of the facts, even if one of you accepts that version of the facts, Conrad Murray is criminally guilty of involuntary manslaughter because he was a substantial factor, and any consequences that rose out of that were entirely ordinary and foreseeable. Defense counsel will have an opportunity to speak, and then I will have an opportunity to speak again briefly following that. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to assure you, as I do now and as I will at the close of my closing argument, I will be asking that you return with the verdict of guilty as to the sole count of involuntary manslaughter, because Conrad Murray caused the death of Michael Jackson. Conrad Murray abandoned Michael Jackson. Conrad Murray gave him propofol and abandoned him. Conrad Murray is criminally liable. Justice demands a guilty verdict. Thank you.
Mr. Walgren, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the noon break a little bit late today, so thank you once again for your patience. We'll be in recess until 1:40 p.m., so court will reconvene at 1:40 this afternoon. Thank you. Remember all the admonishments, please.